Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Mark Zaccaria. This is Common Sense. Welcome back. We're talking today with PatRimoshytus of the Green Cross organization here in Rhode Island. And Pat is a marijuana professional for as a caregiver for the use of medicinal marijuana, and is one, as I said earlier, of a growing number of professionals here in the state giving cannabis a good name as a prescription med.
Hey, thank you.
And I understand you first became acquainted with medical marijuana when you yourself were injured. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
That's true. I was severely injured at work where I had 2 reconstructive surgeries on my spine, which left me with sciatic nerve pain damage. To treat that, I was on a myriad of opiates, all the way from your basic Vicodin up to 120 milligrams of morphine a day. And I'm glad to say that today, with the help of medicinal cannabis, I'm completely opiate free. So when I was first injured, I feel like I lost almost 4 years of my life to painkillers where I just wasn't myself.
And you would say that those opiate painkillers really did have side effects that were noticeable.
Oh, yeah, much more dramatic than cannabis use.
And as you said in the earlier segment, since there are really 2 active ingredients of cannabis, and since you try and use the one that is more medically effective and is less euphoric,
yes,
the actual cannabis products that you administer don't usually make people look at the ceiling and listen to music.
Oh, it all depends. The plant needs a little bit of each of the 2 chemicals to be able to cause that that reaction. It needs both CBD and THC. We have the ability to move the myriad up and down on the ladder, and some people need more THC for pain relief as per se. Other people use pain relief through CBDs, has an anti-inflammatory to it.
So when you say you're a caregiver to a specific patient, you're constantly adjusting things until you find what's right for that patient.
We're trying to specifically, it's very much like wine today with marijuana. There's very many different breeds out there, many different names to them. Some of them are quite exotic, but everyone's genetics are different. Every plant genetic is different. So when you find the 2 that work together for you, it's really quite, it works quite well for most instances.
In our first segment, you mentioned the difference between the Green Cross operation that you manage and a compassion center.
Yeah.
Most people understand a compassion center as a place where people with a medical marijuana card in Rhode Island can go to get the basic marijuana that they need.
Sure, yeah.
How does your operation differ, and is that a better deal for your patients?
Well, actually, since we've been in existence, the compassion centers have actually lowered their prices on the market to be more compatible with the patient market. We take on the consensus that our patients should only have to pay a certain amount for this medicinal product. It only costs a certain amount to grow and make the product, so there's not really a need to make an exuberant amount of money off the backs of legitimately sick people. So their prices are in order, but sometimes they can range pretty high. The average person might not be able to afford it. So we kind of specialize in tracking their medicine so that we can try to get them exactly what they need.
Sounds like the difference between pricing on a business model where you have to have an operation to run and the pricing based on the compassion that you actually have for the patients that you're treating and what they can afford. And
I'd like to think so, yeah. We embrace the whole nonprofit.
Your operation is legal, of course.
It's very legal,
basically,
yes.
You said in our first segment that you have taken pains to get every certification available from the state. The question, I guess, that brings me is, what about the dichotomy between state law, which basically approves of this and is moving towards legalization, and federal law, which still seems to remain stuck in the murder, insanity, and rape age?
Well, I'll tell you something that's a little hard for the average person to believe, that the United States government has allowed one entity to patent medical marijuana and all of its derivatives. Only one entity throughout the entire government. Any guess as to who that is?
No.
It's the U.S. government. So the U.S. government holds the patent for medicinal marijuana while at the same time classifying it as a Schedule I drug. Right. So when you tell people of that hypocrisy, everything else below it falls into space. But basically, for the last 3 or 4 years, I'm not sure exactly, the Department of Justice, part of its funding has had the language written into it that the not allowed to use federal funds to enforce medical marijuana laws in states that have already voted it legal. So basically, the DEA, the FBI, they can't spend funds to enforce medical marijuana laws here in a state that's already voted legal. Now, if my operation was to step outside the law, or if I wasn't a licensed caregiver by the card, then of course they could come in and, I mean, the difference between 12 plants that we're licensed to have and 13 is jail. So obviously we try to stay within the rules.
I find it interesting, however, that the federal government has basically the only license that it has granted itself, and so it sounds like when this kind of ironic dichotomy between legality and illegality, when they get done with their game of cops and robbers, they're going to immediately start a game of Monopoly.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of money to be made right now in the criminal enterprises. I know a lot of our jails are for profit.
I understand that, but once they do finally, the federal government does legalize, what does that do for the cost of the product if they are the only supplier?
Oh, if they're the only supplier, then they have a monopoly, and they can mandate the price however they'd like. We'd all like to think that they would mandate the price as to something affordable, but who's to say?
Yeah, and especially with the big deficits they're running, you don't know. But essentially, the model of the free market is what you were explaining to us earlier when you're talking about the compassion centers having higher prices until such time as operations like Green Cross started to become available and pressure the price downward. The same thing obviously is going to happen if basically anybody could grow the stuff in their backyard. You know, I don't necessarily compete with Dave's Marketplace with the tomatoes I grow in my backyard, but it's kind of a seasonal thing for me.
Well,
but it might be a bigger deal with marijuana.
Our whole motto is to get the medicine to as many people that need it as possible at an affordable rate. So if it was to go legalize and legitimize, first of all, a lot of the stigma, social stigma, would be taken away from that. And if people had access to it, then there'd be no role for me to play, except for the part that I track patients' usage and my interactions with them on a regular basis. I mean, if it was available for everyone at a legitimate cost, then obviously the cost would come down.
Right, but with new people coming into the market, there'd still be room for your educational process.
Sure.
We just have about a minute left in this segment. Can you just give me a brief rundown on the actual procedure you use to produce the RS oil you talked about earlier from the plants that you yourself grow?
Right. Well, I don't actually produce it myself because, well, first of all, I'm not an expert on every field that there is in cannabis. My former career was a firefighter and paramedic. So, I mean, if it was to catch on fire, I could probably do something with it. But as far as making the RSO, we rely on experts to do that. The expert that we have, he became involved in RSO because his wife passed away with cancer, and he only found out about RSO in her later stages and has now dedicated himself to make it. He was relatively well off. He has a significant array of laboratory equipment, Rotovape with a low pressure temperature vacuum system. It basically rinses the material in oil, and then, the material is rinsed in alcohol and then evaporated off through this process. So it's very refined, and we can get it down to the milligram, having that material tested afterwards.
So you have a valued supplier.
I think so.
That's great to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, we will take a break at this particular moment. As always, when we do, watch out for someone to step in and ask the question, "Are you kidding me?"